Hello and welcome to the first speaker in the Perloff Lecture Series on race in transportation. My name is Juan Matute. I'm Deputy Director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, and thank you for joining us today. Okay, today's talk is from Dr. Reagan Patterson. And Dr. Patterson is the Transportation Equity and Research Fellow at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Prior to joining the foundation, Dr. Patterson was a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Michigan Institute for Social Research, where she examined linkages between residential racial segregation and air pollution. Dr. Patterson earned her PhD in environmental engineering at UC Berkeley, and while at UC Berkeley, she was a recipient of the US EPA STAR Fellowship, the Switzer Environmental Fellowship, and the UC Berkeley Chancellor Fellowship. And perhaps most importantly, Dr. Patterson has an undergraduate degree from UCLA, a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering. And so today, Dr. Patterson is joining us to talk about her work with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, producing a report on the future of transportation in the Black community, as well as her academic research around air quality and transportation system impacts. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Patterson, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that warm welcome. I will now share my screen, and we can get started. All right. I hope everyone can now see this. Again, thank you for the welcome. My name is Reagan Patterson. I am currently the Transportation Equity Research Fellow at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation in DC. I'm excited to return to my alma mater to discuss my recent brief in a conversation that brings together my policy and academic work. The very idea of this, of merging, is what really actually underlies this entire talk. And with that, the title of my talk today is New Routes to Equity, the Future of Transportation in the Black Community, which is the same title of my brief. I chose this image to represent this for a couple of reasons. One, it is Black History Month, and this image depicts young folks walking during the Montgomery bus boycott to desegregate buses. And two, though they are walking now, they are smiling. And as one elder Black woman said, since I've been walking, my feet are tired, but my soul's rested. And today we are still in the struggle for transportation equity, but it is one I choose to be in, and one that is rooted in history in a fight for livable Black futures. And to start, I'd like to begin with my entry point to transportation work, which really began while a doctoral student in environmental engineering at UC Berkeley. I hope you were all able to hear that, but I won't embarrass myself further by continuing this video, but going back to a point right here. And here we see this fence, which literally separates a freeway and an elementary school in East Oakland, California. This freeway is the 880, which carries the highest volume of trucks in the San Francisco Bay Area, something that is worsened by a truck ban on the nearby 580, which is also itself a legacy of racial inequity. Here we go. So I first learned about Brookfield from my boss, Dr. David Ralston, and colleague Azubuike Akaba, who I consider dear friends at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. They were planning a vegetation barrier study with the EPA. This image is from the first tree planting event. It really shows the vast blacktop where children play, literally adjacent to the freeway. Now, the two most common reasons kids miss school at Brookfield Elementary School are asthma and lack of transportation. Asthma, well, yeah, that makes sense, given its proximity to this freeway. Now, lack of transportation, that when it is adjacent to this huge transportation infrastructure. So at first, this may seem ironic, but when you think about who and what freeways were constructed to carry, you realize that this is in fact by design, and it's not just Oakland. And so what we see at Brookfield is representative of the very deliberate targeting of and inequitable effects on Black communities, inequities that began with the very construction of freeways. I illustrate this in my report with this image of Detroit. Following the Federal Aid Highway Act, highway construction and urban renewal, or Negro removal programs, inequitably impacted the Black community. Highway construction resulted in the demolition, division, and displacement of Black neighborhoods, as well as the destruction of local economies. So this image is of Chrysler Freeway, or I-75, construction in Detroit, which paved over two Black neighborhoods, Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. Here is another view, which really allows us to see the change and destruction caused by the construction of Chrysler Freeway. These two images are from the same location in Detroit, Michigan. And again, this happened all over the nation. Here are two images that really depict the consequence and impact of interstate or highway construction in Atlanta. And this slide is of the impact of the Claiborne Expressway in New Orleans. In addition to archival photos and newspapers, the stories continue to be passed from generation to generation. I am currently reading Sarah Bottom's The Yellow House, a multi-generational story of her family and home. And I'd like to read this excerpt. It reads, "The Interstate Bridge, erected in 1968 to provide access to New Orleans East and beyond, ran above part of what was once a thriving Black community, above what was once the Black shopping district with tailors and clothing stores, five and dime stores, restaurants. Joseph, Elaine, and Ivory shopped there as children. My mother shopped there when she had children. The neutral ground where the homeless lived in 2008 was lined back then with more than 200 great oaks, the longest continuous line of oaks to be found anywhere in America, all of them bulldozed to make way for the concrete bridge. Move over, trees," read the headline in the Vous Carré Courier. I probably mispronounced that, which could afford to be flippant. The French Quarter avoided a similar expressway that would have wiped out the neighborhood. The city's political and business elite put up a winning fight. For the bridge in Claiborne, there was a battle too, but Black people, under-resourced and overextended, had bigger wars to win, like basic civil rights. The bridge won. And I read this because it is through such powerful anecdotes that we reinsert people into these landscapes. And so to continue in this idea of the power of story, I will show this video of me scrolling through the responses to Calvin Gladney, the CEO of Smart Growth Americas, his tweet, which read, "Name a highway that raised or divided a Black or brown neighborhood in your city or a city you know. I'll start. I-95 through the Overton neighborhood in Miami, Florida." And so we're going to sit with this for a second. And I will stop there, but this continues and continues for 6 minutes. And I'll note, although this massive amount of responses cannot adequately convey the magnitude of destruction across the nation, it does start to get at the human consequence. All across the nation, this was happening. And here, these two images represent my motivation for this work, as mentioned earlier, being rooted in history. And they are a reminder of the very real human consequence of our transportation work, enduring consequences that contribute to ongoing challenges affecting Black folks in transportation. So the consequences of highway investment, along with discriminatory housing and lending policies, include an automobile-dominated transportation system, restricted mobility, stolen wealth and concentrated poverty, increased air and noise pollution, and heightened risk of pedestrian injuries. Freeway investment and public transit disinvestment literally paved the way for the current state of transportation in the Black community. When looking at ongoing challenges, the report focuses specifically on issues related to access, sustainability, and safety. For the report, access refers to people's ability to use mobility options and to reach goods and services. Sustainability refers to the impact on the environment and health. And safety refers to traffic-related injuries and fatalities, as well as issues related to policing. I'll begin by focusing on challenges due to our automobile-dominated transportation system. Access. On average, 14% of Black households' pre-tax income is spent on transportation. This does vary by income. High-income Black households spend 10% of their pre-tax income on transportation, compared to up to 30% for low-income Black households. 20% of Black households do not have access to an automobile. This is the highest percentage among all races and ethnicities, and 1/3 of low-income African Americans live in a zero-vehicle household. Almost 1 in 4 public transit riders are African American, and 10% of African Americans rely on public transit to get to their jobs. With this heavy reliance on public transit, mobility in the Black community has been devastated by COVID-19, where already underfunded transit systems have been wrecked. And the adverse effects are just an added layer to that caused by gentrification, rising housing costs, and decreasing affordable housing stocks, pushing African Americans out of cities and farther away from work. In terms of sustainability, 24% of African Americans live near highly trafficked roads. African Americans are more likely to live and attend school near major roadways, which contributes to racial disparities and exposure to traffic-related air pollution. 9% of Black adults and 14% of Black children have asthma. Exposure to traffic-related air pollution is associated with asthma and many other adverse health effects. African Americans have the highest rates of asthma morbidity and mortality, with greater disparities for Black children. And 19% of total related deaths from 2004, total heat-related deaths from 2004 to 2018 were African American. Transportation is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, with the majority being from light-duty vehicles, which are cars and trucks. Climate change impacts disproportionately affects Black communities. And with regard to safety, 18% of traffic-related pedestrian deaths are African American. Black pedestrians and bicyclists are more likely to be hit and killed than white ones. Unsafe street infrastructure, such as inadequate sidewalks, lighting, signage, and crosswalks contribute to this. And last, but certainly not least, Black drivers are 20% more likely to be stopped by police than white drivers on average. The most common police-initiated contact is the traffic stop. Racial disparities in traffic stops vary across states and cities. In LA, for instance, Black folks are twice as likely to get stopped by the LA County Sheriff's Department and 4 times more likely to be searched, yet less likely to have contraband. And this has deadly consequences, as a disproportionate share of people shot and killed by police at traffic stops are Black. The previous figures highlight challenges caused by a car-centric transportation system. And I thought it was important to do so to really contextualize the introduction of emerging mobility options. And so what motivated the report is the fact that our transportation system is being transformed by three rapidly evolving and emerging mobility options: shared mobility, electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles. Shared mobility types include bike share, scooter share, car share, ride share, and ride hailing. Then there are electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. Shared mobility and electric vehicles are already penetrating the transportation sector. And while they offer an immense opportunity to address transportation inequities, they have not adequately done so, and challenges exist. So starting again with access. 6% of all bike trips are made by African Americans, which includes bike share. African Americans experience the largest disparities in bike share participation rates. And while citing is a factor, lower rates remain even after controlling for it. And some barriers are cost, limited information, as well as concerns about traffic safety and racial profiling by police. 17% of Black households are unbanked and 30% are underbanked. And this is an issue because most shared mobility services require a debit or credit card. 25% of Black households do not have a smartphone. This, along with disparities in high-speed broadband coverage, hinder the ability to access app-based shared mobility options. Sustainability. Only 3% of hybrid vehicle buyers and 2% of plug-in electric vehicle buyers in California are African American. And I use these stats because California accounts for half of all electric vehicles in the United States. So I figure this provides a preview of what we can expect elsewhere. Then returning to safety. While I do not have statistics, I call your attention to shared mobility in while Black. I recognize the gender imbalance given that Black folks of all gender identities are disproportionately killed by police. However, today I show Patrick Harmon, who was killed in 2017 in Salt Lake City after being pulled over for riding a bike with improper lighting. Dijon Kizzee, who was killed last August in LA after riding his bike in the wrong direction. And Karan Hilton Brown, who died in a car crash in October here in DC while being chased for riding a Revel electric scooter on a sidewalk without a helmet. I say their names and share their stories to convey the very real implications of shared mobility on Black lives. And so now at this moment, a moment that is the legacy of both historical and contemporary transportation policies and practices, what are the new routes to equity? Ultimately, I believe any route that leads to or complements free, accessible, climate just, and safe public transit is a route to equity. For those of you who have read the brief, this should not come to you as a surprise. Right now, I'd say there are two different paths on this road to transportation equity. Do they meet back at this? I say there's an opportunity, but as my previous slides show, no, not in the current state. And that's because one path focuses on how do we make sure the emerging mobilities equitably serve the Black community, my report. And the other path is, well, until we dismantle the systems in which inequity is reproduced and by design, inequities will continue. And my research that I'll discuss starts to get at this conversation. So all of the equity-focused policy recommendations in the report can really be grouped into four themes. The first being that emerging mobilities, shared mobility, electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles must complement public transit. This includes co-locating bike share and scooter share. My apologies. So shared mobility options should be integrated with public transit. And so this includes co-locating bike share and scooter share docking stations at bus stops and rail stations, as well as transit agencies partnering with ride-hailing services to expand shuttle service to and from transit stations. Public transit fare method should be integrated with shared mobility services. And this entails not only allowing transit riders to use their transit card and the attached debit or credit card, but accepting transit card balances for payment. And in areas underserved by public transit, shared mobility options should be expanded, particularly fixed route van pooling between residential areas and jobs and essential services with late night and weekend service. With regard to autonomous vehicles, they should be deployed as fully accessible, high occupancy electric vehicles like the Smart Circuit Shuttle in Columbus, Ohio's Linden neighborhood to fulfill mobility gaps. Secondly, policies must lower barriers to use. To do so, shared mobility services should be required to accept multiple payment options, such as transit cards or cash, including prepaid cards. An example of a bike share program accepting prepaid cards is Bay Wheels as part of its Bike Share for All program. And so this is an image actually of my friend riding a Bay Wheels bike in Oakland, courtesy of another friend. This practice helps ensure access for unbanked and underbanked individuals. Also, shared mobility services should be required to offer lower cost options to improve affordability for low income, transit, and student riders. And this has gained attention during COVID, particularly as transit service cuts have forced essential workers to rely on these more expensive transportation options. Next, shared mobility services should not require a smartphone for access, but have non-app booking options, such as online, kiosk, or phone computer service. And finally, although not required to scan, scooter share rules do indicate that users should have a license, and this should just be removed, given that only 16 states and DC allow undocumented folks to get a license, and license suspensions disproportionately impact Black folks due to racially discriminatory policing. The third policy bucket is that vehicle fleets must be zero emission. This includes both shared and autonomous vehicles. And given President Biden's appointments of Gina McCarthy, John Kerry, Brenda Mallory, and Michael Regan, along with his climate executive orders, it is clear that the current administration will help advance the transition to electric vehicles. This transition will also require public-private partnerships with auto manufacturers and ride-hailing and car share services. And I don't watch football, but and I'm assuming a lot of you did hear about and watch the GM Super Bowl ad with Will Ferrell for a little humor. Additionally, autonomous vehicles should operate as high occupancy pooled services as opposed to privately owned single occupancy vehicles. We need a different model, one that shifts from car-centric and instead centers public transit. And now to get to the part about being climate just. For electric vehicles to truly be zero emission vehicles, federal and state governments must commit to carbon-free sources of electricity. This requires divestment from fossil fuels and investment in non-hydro renewable energy sources, which will reduce toxic air pollution and greenhouse gas and benefit Black communities, which are disproportionately impacted by coal plants and oil and gas facilities. Lastly, I'm adamant about calling attention to the fact that currently electric vehicle production is rooted in the same system of capitalist extraction and exploitation. For instance, mining for cobalt in the Congo and polluting indigenous communities in South America, such as Bolivia. So much so that some thought that the US-supported coup in Bolivia was motivated by an interest in accessing its lithium. Regardless of whether that's accurate or not, it speaks to the need to find sustainable alternatives. The remaining policies on safety can really be framed as policies that divest from police and surveillance and invest in Black communities. The first is to fund safe street infrastructure projects in Black communities to reduce pedestrian and bicyclist injuries and fatalities. This includes investing in complete streets and safe routes to schools, investing in local hiring and disadvantaged business enterprises, and investing in anti-displacement strategies. However, as Tamika Butler points out in her piece called Safe Roads for All, for there to be safety, it is necessary to address the many ways Black folks experience violence, including racialized policing, which supports the need to divest from policing and surveillance. Traffic enforcement in Black communities is often used for revenue generation rather than actual traffic safety, which contributes to over-policing. On top of this, 42 states and DC suspend driver's license for unpaid fines and fees, and driving with a suspended license can result in arrest, more fines and fees, and misdemeanor or felony charges. States must repeal failure to pay laws, but more importantly, federal, state, and local governments must divest and invest in communities, including free and accessible public transit. Such policies empower freedom of movement. And then there are so many folks who are for autonomous vehicles because they improve safety. But as Brenton Mock asked in his article entitled Can self-driving cars protect Black people from police violence? He asked, are Black people less likely to get pulled over by police in self-driving cars? Do autonomous vehicles come with bulletproof seatbelts to shield African Americans restrained in passenger seats like Philando Castile was? Can the automated vehicle protect the Black woman from being pulled out of a car by police and slammed onto the pavement like what happened to Breonna King? We must ensure autonomous vehicles actually improve safety for Black folks. And so these comprehensive policies regarding shared mobility, electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles provide a pathway toward an equitable future. Importantly, the policy recommendations must be adapted and tailored to the specific needs of local Black communities based on meaningful community engagement in the decision-making process. Taking this one step further, planning processes should incorporate principles of self-determination, as Rashada King Williams discusses in his paper on reparative planning. Which brings me back to this. Up until now, we were on one path focusing on emerging mobility technologies. Now we will venture down the other path towards systems change. And to that end, we will have a conversation on freeway removal. So several different factors have led to freeway removal or rerouting. This is not new. Initial removal projects began in the 1970s in Portland, New York City, and Boston. These cities replaced their elevated freeways with a park, boulevard, and tunnel. And these removals were due to the anti-highway sentiment in the 1960s and early 1970s. Then in the 1990s, 3 urban elevated freeways were removed or rerouted in the Bay Area and replaced with street-level boulevards after being damaged by the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, the Embarcadero and Central freeways in San Francisco, and the Cypress Freeway in West Oakland. An example of a recently completed project is the Seattle-Alaskan Way Viaduct. And today, I will take us back to Oakland. Environmental justice activists see freeway removal or rerouting as an opportunity to redress the social and environmental impacts of freeway construction. So this is the first image you've seen previously, and altogether these 3 images show the demolition of West Oakland to build the Cypress Freeway. West Oakland was a redlined neighborhood and one of the few East Bay neighborhoods where Black folks could own homes. Construction of the Cypress Freeway led to property demolitions and displaced 600 families. The freeway, completed in 1958, bisected West Oakland. Freeway construction, including the 2 other freeways in West Oakland, along with other urban renewal projects, destroyed over 5,000 housing units and resulted in economic decline in the area. When the Cypress Freeway collapsed during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, the California Department of Transportation favored a rebuild option on the same alignment. However, unlike during urban renewal, the National Environmental Protection Act of 1969 provided the community with the opportunity to participate in the decision-making process. Community activists organized to oppose reconstruction along the original route and redress economic and environmental justice issues. After the public comment period ended in 1991, Caltrans selected an alternative route around the perimeter and an industrial area, seen here. Some felt the proposal didn't adequately address local concerns and filed a discrimination suit under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This case was settled out of court and brought in mitigation measures, including the transformation of the former freeway into a landscape boulevard, later known as Mandela Parkway. Freeway removal or rerouting projects often involve building street-level landscape boulevards in the former corridor. Transforming the former freeway alignment into a landscape boulevard increases green space. However, an unintentional consequence of efforts to expand urban green space is the green space paradox. Walsh et al. Describes that while the creation of new green space to address environmental justice problems can make neighborhoods healthier and more aesthetically attractive, it can also increase housing costs and property values, leading to gentrification and displacement of the very residents the green space strategies were designed to benefit. This paradoxical situation has been termed environmental gentrification. And this diagram shows this process, where you have environmental justice activism leading to greening, leading to new environmental amenities, but through reinvestment and redevelopment, you get gentrification and displacement. So in the study I want to briefly go through, I investigated the air pollution and neighborhood impacts of rerouting the Cypress Freeway and constructing a street-level boulevard. My specific objectives were to quantify the local effects of rerouting the Cypress Freeway on air pollution by comparing two routing scenarios and examining neighborhood socioeconomic and demographic impacts as reflected by spatial temporal changes and indicators of gentrification to assess whether existing residents benefit or are excluded through the phenomenon of environmental gentrification. So I assessed two routing scenarios. The first was the rebuild in place, which was the rejected plan to reconstruct the damaged Cypress Freeway on the original alignment. And the second being reroutes, which was the completed plan, which involved reconstructing the freeway along a different route, IA-80, around the residential neighborhood and replacing the removed section with a street level boulevard, later called Mandela Parkway. I estimated NOx and black carbon concentrations, and this is because West Oakland is a port adjacent community that is heavily impacted by heavy duty truck traffic, and heavy duty trucks are major sources of NOx and black carbon. And so one thing I really like about this project, and also the only reason the study was possible, is the use of community data. Traffic count data for Mandela Parkway are from the West Oakland Truck Study, a community-based participatory research project by the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and Sonoma Technologies, Inc. For the rebuild in place scenario, I combined truck survey counts with traffic data on the IA-80 reroute from Caltrans. So from these counts, I was able to estimate emissions and then predict near roadway concentrations using the R-line dispersion model. To investigate the impacts of freeway rerouting on neighborhood change, I compared 1990 and 2010 demographic, socioeconomic, and housing variables. Demographic variables include racial and ethnic characteristics. Socioeconomic indicators include median household income, percent with at least a bachelor's degree, and percent living in poverty. And housing characteristics include median rent, median home value, and percent renter occupied buildings. And so variables were compared within the 250 band in which pollutant emissions were estimated, concentrations were modeled using an area weighted method. And so these maps show the impact of the Cypress rebuild in place and reroute scenarios on NOx concentration. And I only present NOx because it is visually similar to that of DC. The maps substantiate that by rerouting the Cypress Freeway, high concentrations shift from the residential area here to around the periphery. With a 38% reduction in annual average NOx concentration and a 25% reduction for black carbon. And these results provide quantitative support for replacing a freeway with a boulevard to reduce the traffic burden in residential areas, particularly regarding heavy-duty diesel trucks, and consequently provide air quality benefits. This figure shows average annual concentrations of NOx at increasing different distances from the Mandela alignment. Each data point represents an average value for all model receptors within 25-meter bands. So you can imagine that the freeway is here in the middle, and each point is representative across the 25-meter band. And so for the rebuild in place scenario, the concentrations decrease noticeably when moving away from the freeway in both directions. Notice here by the black line, following standard distance decay relationship. Most importantly, though, the figure further demonstrates that rerouting achieved large concentration reduction. Annual average pollutant concentrations within 25 meters of Mandela, so here, decreased by 66% for NOx and 48% for black carbon as a result of rerouting. Again, this provides quantitative evidence of how rerouting reduces the air quality burden. And lastly, this table presents the average change in demographic, socioeconomic, and housing indicators between 1990 and 2010 for all tracks in West Oakland and within 250 meters of the Mandela Parkway alignment. Firstly, essentially every indicator suggests that gentrification occurred throughout West Oakland, including the area within 250 meters between 1990 and 2010. We see decreases in percent non-white residents, percent residents living in poverty, and percent renter occupied units, along with a growth of median household income, median rent, median home value, and percent college educated residents. The table also provides evidence of environmental gentrification along Mandela Parkway. There was a larger decline in the percent of residents living in poverty and a sharper decrease in the Black population compared to West Oakland. Reductions in the Black population may be due to increases in the cost of housing. The median home value increased more along Mandela Parkway. In fact, median home values were lower along the Cypress Freeway than in West Oakland as a whole, but higher after converting to the parkway. Larger property value increases along Mandela Parkway may be due to the freeway rerouting and conversion to the boulevard, which is consistent with previous studies. One thing to note is that the area along Mandela Parkway had smaller increases in median rents, which may be due to the presence of affordable housing units. So preserving affordable housing units can reduce the displacement of intergenerational residents. Now, West Oakland residents saw rerouting the Cypress Freeway and replacement with a landscape boulevard as an opportunity to mitigate the air pollution burden caused by freeway construction and increase access to urban green space. Results show that rerouting did in fact result in substantial pollutant reductions. Additionally, freeway rerouting and construction of a boulevard resulted in some environmental gentrification and displacement of longtime Black residents. This displacement is facilitated, as I showed in the diagram earlier, through economic revitalization efforts that don't prioritize the needs of existing residents. And here I say freeway rerouting and construction of a landscape boulevard can be a mechanism of environmental gentrification, something we'll address now. So as I previously mentioned, freeway removal is an opportunity to redress the failures of mid-20th century urban transportation policy. But as demonstrated by the Cypress Freeway case, while the urban freeway was thought of as a tool for urban revitalization by mid-century transportation planners, the removal and rerouting of the urban freeway are viewed as opportunities for redevelopment. In saying this, it makes sense that intergenerational Black residents didn't benefit because freeways are grounded in systems of oppression, white supremacy, racial capitalism, which systematically sacrifice and disregard Black folks and are maintained in new forms. So we need systems change for Black folks to benefit. We need a reparative planning model. And one idea is to use urban freeway removal as a tool for reparation-style green infrastructure, which builds off of Charles Brown's reparation-style infrastructure. And this would start to get at that idea of reparations, self-determination, and community ownership, reclaiming space and the subsequent planning and design to ensure Black residents truly benefit. And you may be wondering, who is this lady? What is she talking about with freeway removal? But this idea is neither crazy nor radical. This is from the Downtown Oakland Specific Plan. And so this is the I-980 and a rendering of a potential replacement. And the specific plan reads, either approach will require assessment of impacts to the surrounding community and vulnerable populations, as well as requirements for significant public benefits, including opportunities to mitigate the impacts of prior policy decisions that have harmed those populations. Additionally, last December, Senator Chuck Schumer introduced the Economic Justice Act, which includes $10 billion for a pilot program called the Restoring Neighborhoods and Strengthening Communities Program to help tear down urban freeways in low-income communities of color and fund efforts for communities to decide what to do with the land, including funds for community land trusts. And so I think we can agree, regardless of our political leanings, that Chuck Schumer is not a radical. And so today we went down two paths. One, to help ensure shared mobility, electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles do not perpetuate existing transportation equities. The other, to look at transportation as a system embedded in larger systems of oppression. So at the very beginning of this talk, I said that the underlying theme is merging or intersection. And to me, the solution, free, accessible, climate just, and safe public transit, lies at the intersection of these two paths. And to get there, I leave you with these two guiding questions. So, how do we orient emerging mobilities toward a goal of reparative justice? And as we dismantle systems, what will exist in their place? Thank you. And so here's my contact information. Also, if you have not yet read the report, this is the link where you can access that. And that concludes my talk.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson. That was quite informative. And thank you for sharing your work and your research. So I would like to remind attendees, I put this in the chat, but we do have a Q&A feature on Zoom that'll allow you to pose your own questions that we will ask of Dr. Patterson. I've done some of my homework and have a couple of questions prepared for you. I really like how you yeah, you've set these two paths. I see each path in California's work, um, where there has been a focus on increasing access to new mobility services. I think that's been a chief concern of, for example, LADOT's policies surrounding micromobility and other new mobility. But and that's, I think, ongoing and has been happening for several years. Um, but I think we do see California starting to look towards that other path of more transformative change and dismantling the existing system to um, reduce the perpetuation of inequities in the future. So, for example, Caltrans now, as of a few years ago, has a race and equity program and a race and equity action plan. The Air Resources Board recently hired a deputy executive officer for environmental justice, Chanel Fletcher. And I was, as somebody with experience both in California working with research in Oakland when you were at Berkeley, but also at the federal level, how do you see perhaps the federal level policy learning from California's experience and experiences in both what to do and what not to do?
Thank you for that question. And so, yes, being able to see and work from a local in California state and national, um, something that you see in this conversation, and great research recently came out, is about how do you accelerate the introduction of electric vehicles. And so one thing that uh, studies have shown that the rebate programs and a lot of the funding mechanisms that are used to help with this transition have not actually fully reached the people that they were meant to. Study came out that involved my actual district, one of my committee members, Rachel Miller-Frosch, showing, and several other studies showing that these kind of funding mechanisms have not gone to low income residents of color. And so learning about how can we actually target these to actually be useful for um, um, residents of color, low income residents of color. Additionally, larger scale, looking at transportation, learning from California's cap and trade. And so a lot of time, that kind of conversation is happening at a federal level and is also happening regionally over here in DC, also more in the New England states with these transportation regional agreements. And something though, since my work in this has come from an environmental justice background, cap and trade is not something that is rooted in justice. Again, it is a market mechanism. And so it's how do we ensure not these market-based solutions, but other solutions. And so learning kind of from the shortfall and pitfalls of these kinds of deemed solutions. Again, research coming out of California showing that cap and trade actually increases exposures, particularly in communities of color. So again, getting away from market-based solutions, but having more imaginative and a reimagining of what these systems can look like. So things that we can learn from and avoid that California is trying. California is kind of like the experimental ground, and then the rest of the country says, hey, what can we do? So yeah, really centering equity.
And we're getting some great questions in the Q&A feature, and we'll contacting some of those questioners about going on camera to ask them. So I have one more question in the meantime before handing it over to the audience. And so the research I do and the discussions I'm involved in typically center around public transit funding and programs. And it's starting to seem, for example, Los Angeles Metro is studying fareless transit. It's starting to seem more within reach than it has in years past, to especially perhaps as part of COVID recovery and rebuilding ridership. And so what I was wondering, how you see free transit as essential or important to Black communities.
Yes, a very important question. It's something that I was trying to get at my talk. Free transit is necessary for Black folks for every reason, from accessibility and in terms of affordability, as well as sustainability, as to allow access to this and use of this, as well as safety. And the kind of confluence of this shows up in, for instance, Congresswoman Iona Presley's Freedom to Move Act, where it would provide grants to public transit agencies that are providing fare free transit, but as a result of the grant, being a grant recipient, they have to decriminalize fare evasion. And so what we see is that we see inequitable transit enforcement and policing. We also see, for instance, the BART and the killing of Oscar Grant. And so free public transit really just has implications for access, sustainability, and safety.
Okay, and my colleague Madeline's working to bring one of our questioners on camera, but in the meantime, I do have a question. And it's about, from Lawrence Brown, about VMT reductions as a goal for transportation sustainability policy. So in California, the official policy is that policies like SB 375 are designed to reduce vehicle miles of travel. They don't necessarily have an equity component built in, so it doesn't say whose VMT is being reduced. And these VMT reduction goals are being fought by groups that are worried that this policy will have an equitable impact on mobility, but also on home ownership of those who seek to live in the suburban fringe, ex-urban areas where homes may be more affordable to all people, including low-income people of color. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on, or Lawrence was wondering if you had any thoughts on that trade-off and where there may be some mitigating options for VMT reduction.
Yes, and this is actually something that I've been thinking about myself because of the impact of gentrification and displacement, particularly for Black communities being forced out of city centers and into these suburban areas, particularly where homes are potentially more affordable. And so, to me, as studies have shown, like overall, for instance, transit-oriented development has decreased vehicle miles traveled, but no one, like this question is saying, no one's really said what has been the impact on communities that have been pushed out. And so I don't necessarily think that the fight should be against VMT reductions. I think the fight should be for increasing public transit and increasing mobility for folks who are pushed out to these areas. And so it's where in this fight and what would be the strategy? And I think the strategy is, how do we ensure access to public transit for folks who are pushed out? And that's where I would put my effort personally, more so than the VMT reductions, because that has so many benefits. But again, how do we increase the mobility of people pushed out?
Okay, great. And for those of you joining us, we have the Q&A feature that's built into Zoom that has several questions lined up. You can pose your own there or vote on others that you've liked asked. If you've asked a question, please monitor your Zoom chat because we may be trying to get in touch with you to allow you to ask that question on video and interact with Dr. Patterson. So for the next question, I will turn it over to my colleague Madeline Brosen to ask this question.
Great. Thank you, Juan, and thank you, Dr. Patterson. The next question comes from Lauren Hiller, who is a second-year master's student in the urban planning program at UCLA. And she asks, Black communities use bikes at high rates, but bike lanes and other bike facilities have been viewed with suspicion by communities of color because of their association with gentrification. So the question to you is, how would you suggest that planners support communities in bringing community-appropriate bike facilities without facilitating displacement or shrugging off the responsibility entirely?
Great. And so this question really gets at who is doing the designing. And so for me, it's in addition to community engagement, it's really community led. What kind of infrastructure and how that is implemented, how can that best serve those who this is supposed to serve? And so again, that really gets back to, in addition to community engagement, what's it mean for self-determination and planning? If the power is given to community where governments are saying, hey, we're willing to invest in this, give us the plan that you would see, I think that is the kind of model that would start to shift the kind of hesitancy and suspicion around this. Because again, all of this infrastructure is associated with gentrification. Trees going into urban communities. There was a great article that came out years ago where a mom turns to her child and she says, those aren't for us. Bike infrastructure is part of that same narrative. And the list continues. So again, who is doing the decision making, and how is that decision making happening? And is it more in this reparative planning model that I advocate and I'm a proponent for? And so again, if we really start to look at that process, I think these kinds of solutions will start to emerge from just a shifting and reorienting of how this work is happening and who the power or where the power really lies in the decision making.
Great, thank you for that answer. The next question is about the highway removal. And Abigail Flores asks, as you pointed out, that removing freeways often increases land value along the alignment. Makes sense. You don't have this, overarching negative externality in your backyard. So she asks, in addition to requiring low-income housing, what steps can be taken to lessen gentrification there? And as you mentioned, have the people who are most affected actually benefit from the removal?
Yes, definitely affordable housing, but great question in terms of what else. And so when we look at that, the what else is, in my opinion, an example of the what else can begin to be imagined when you look at this legislation that Chuck Schumer introduced around, okay, we have the funds, and the funds are going to be allocated in the way in which the community sees. And so, again, what are those plans? And through things such as community land trust, making sure that the property ownership in the community stays with community. And so those are kinds of solutions that I think that we need to start going to who owns this land, and kind of shifting property ownership. And I think that is something that will really have benefits for Black residents.
And kind of a follow-up to that, Stuart asks that, beyond this, I think that you kind of mentioned about, the concerns on gentrifications, but can you talk about if there's other types of pushback that's presented when the idea of removing a freeway is proposed?
Sure. And so just thinking about pushback, and so in a previous conversation where I talked about freeway removal, someone asked me, for instance, well, what about folks who are like, how am I supposed to get here? And folks that are worried about getting around, like, where are the cars going to go? And so then to that, I say, one, let's remember who freeways were built to carry. And so they really supported suburban commute into the city. And so that is one. And two, I say, if the issue then is where do your cars go, then how about we have solutions around you don't need the car and public transit. And so for me, that's really the ultimate solution. And so pushback around, well, how am I supposed to get around? I think really the solution to that is can we plan our transportation systems to ensure that everyone has access to public transit. And so I hope I answered the question in terms of what could be a potential pushback, which is, well, how am I supposed to get around? And then the answer to that is, let's invest in public transit.
Okay. So Jorge and Robin, we're looking to queue you up We didn't intend to ask all of the questions on our own. So if you can monitor your chat and let us know if you're comfortable with us putting you on camera, because I know not everybody joins a webinar at noon expecting to go on, but we do have that option. Madeline, do you have another question prepared for us?
Yeah, so, and I appreciate Dr. Patterson doing a great job of just the rapid fire and the many different topics that you managed to cover in your talk. I think it's really, it's bringing a lot of questions. So I want to ask this question from Ali Mir, because they ask, your presentation clearly articulated the challenges of approaching equity from the singular lens of transportation-oriented solutions. And what you've really highlighted is the manifestation of systemic racism in a bunch of other spheres. The questioner asks about redlining and zoning, lending, policing, environmental burdens and justice. But kind of coming back to transportation, what are your thoughts for those that are transportation and transit planners? What can we do to better connect these mobility solutions and kind of the tools that we have in the field of transportation to some of these other larger systemic changes that need to be realized to really advance the needle and come up with a more equitable transportation system?
Great question. And so I think this comes back to bringing it back to the message. And so I intentionally name all of these other issues because to me, they are transportation solutions. Public transit for access, sustainability, and safety is a transportation solution. And so building out and ensuring that transportation planners really are planning public transit free and accessible public transit systems, as well as potentially other shared mobility to increase mobility and fill mobility gaps. That is a transportation solution. Along with the funding structures of transportation. And so how are there, for instance, a current intern at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation asked me about housing and working with housing programs to give free transit vouchers. And so things like that to me are transportation solutions. And so how are they being funded? How are we increasing accessibility to them? And so again, public transit, the hours and service of public transit, something that I don't think I talked about, but has definitely attention has been called to this as essential workers who work non-standard hours, and transit service may not always be available to them. And so what kind of transportation solutions can help ensure mobility for those for workers who work non-standard hours? In terms of rurality, how do we reach people? And again, that is a transit solution. So really, the transit solutions, in my opinion, really extend to how do we extend the connectivity of public transit and public transit system, and how do we expand commuter rail, but really focusing on buses as well as rail.
So we're really covering a whole breadth of topics here, which is great. I wanted to ask about something that you that was in the report that you touched on in the presentation, and that's about artificial intelligence and machine learning and training data, and the importance of using diverse population skin colors in what we're teaching vehicles to understand and avoid. I was wondering if you could go more into that and the need for that for safety.
Yeah, so I'm glad you raised this. And so a lot of things that we're hearing in the news around automation and artificial intelligence is that the artificial intelligence is perpetuating racism. And we're seeing this in systems such as surveillance and recognition of people. And so when you bring that into transportation, there was an article that got a lot peer-reviewed, a journal article that got a lot of attention, I believe a couple of years back, that suggested that autonomous vehicles and their AI does not recognize darker skin tones to the same degree that it recognizes lighter skin tones. And so the potential consequence of this would be if I'm crossing the street, what does the car see? Will I be hit, or am I is my likelihood of being hit increased because of my darker skin tone? And so this is a concern that this article raised, and so it sparked a lot of conversation. And so since my background's not in AI, I am an engineer, but not that kind of engineer. And so I just wanted to raise that point in and bring attention to that point in the brief to make sure that the data sets in which autonomous vehicles are being trained on are protective for all people, including people with darker skin tone.
Absolutely. Madeline, do you have another question queued up from our audience?
Yes, so this next question comes from Jorge Cañas, who's one of the alumni of the planning program at UCLA. He asks kind of your thoughts on how this comes back to a particular solution. So especially in Los Angeles, but not just here, there's a lot of conversations about advancing congestion pricing to better manage our transportation system. And so the question asks, what are your thoughts about congestion pricing policies if the money and revenue goes to fund sustainable transit projects in historically marginalized communities?
Thank you for that question. And so, again, to me, I do not support congestion pricing because it is, again, a market-based solution, which typically have inequitable effects that disproportionately affect communities of color. And so I will use the cap and trade as an analogy for this. I mentioned it earlier in the peer-reviewed article that describes how cap and trade, even though is it 25% of cap and trade funds have to go into disadvantaged communities or be used for projects in disadvantaged communities. However, what we see is that cap and trade actually has increased pollution in communities of color. And so I use this example to say that I disagree with the congestion pricing because, again, even if there is a targeting of funds to communities of color, the initial problem, the problem still will disproportionately affect communities of color. And so I think that we need to think of other non-market-based solutions to really get at this, such as public transit.
Great. So I think this next question kind of exists a little bit between kind of the market-based solutions and also how policy can try to intervene. So thinking about electric vehicles and going to a cleaner transportation fleet. Sherry Wilson asks, can you speak to the type of programs that could ensure lower income households are being appropriately targeted to ensure the increased adoption of EVs? What are your thoughts about EV rebates and incentives? I know that in California, we did a pretty poor job, I think, as the first couple of rounds of these incentives of really targeting them. So ideas about, is that a potential solution? What are other ones that might also help that? And other kind of policy solutions to try to increase adoption.
Great, thank you for this question. Where to begin? So electric vehicles, as we've seen, I'll give a few different takes on this. So electric vehicles, as we've seen in California, again, only 3% of plug-in electric vehicle buyers are African American. But to help further contextualize this, as I also mentioned in my report, 3% of regular gasoline car buyers are African American. So it's actually about the same percentage. And so how I interpret this, or what I think this really means, is that cars are not the solution for mobility for African Americans. As I also mentioned earlier, 20% of African Americans don't even have a car. A third of low-income African Americans live in a zero-vehicle household. And so to me, unless we're giving away free cars are not the solution. Yes, we can do a better job of targeting and encouraging and informing folks about electric vehicles. And I know that a lot is happening. I mentioned the General Motors ad with Will Ferrer earlier. So a lot is happening to try to spark interest in this electric vehicle conversation. However, in my opinion, I think we really need to focus on shared electric mobility. I mentioned the van pooling services. I mentioned using kind of these shared mobilities to access transit. And so, and building and planning our community so that we don't rely on these single occupancy vehicles, but are able to get high occupancy vehicles and public transit. And so for me, cars and more, there was actually a great tweet. I do want to mention there was a great tweet where there's 4 images and it just showed cars, electric cars, autonomous cars, and it was just cars. And so it's like, to replace cars with other kinds of cars, it's just the latest tech, but that has not solved the access question to for mobility in the Black community. And so I think we really need to look at other solutions like shared mobility, like shuttle services and public transit.
Great. This next question, I think, kind of builds on that, about kind of, thinking about, the effects of our transportation system. And Robin Chase asks, how can we deal with the urgency of addressing climate change and all of the negative externalities that go along with it, with what you've also mentioned, which is the need to slow down and engage with local communities and really approach this through a reparations style planning model?
Great question. And I love that you mentioned reparations style infrastructure. And so that is a great question. And so, one, in terms of urgency, I think we already have such extensive transportation built that we can start to have that transition into electric models. And so, for instance, buses and school buses, we can already, the immediacy of just of transitioning these vehicles into zero emission vehicles is something that we can do now, or at least with funding. And it seems like the current president is behind this. And so, so really, I think something that we can do immediately is starting to shift some of these transits into cleaner transit modes. And so that's immediate. But then when we talk about expanding access and what does that look like on the impacts on communities, that's when we need to have these conversations. And so that's something that will take time. But we can already do a lot around particularly diesel buses, even hybrid buses, and improving and transitioning those to clean energy sources.
Great. I'm amazed how much ground we're covering, and I'm gonna test the boundaries a little bit more and talk about development patterns and urban design that might relate to your air quality modeling work. And so the predominant development strategy in California has been corridor-oriented, transit-oriented development, so along BRT routes and light rail, heavy rail routes, typically near the stations around the rail, because the stations are placed further apart. And these routes tend to be surface streets with higher volumes of transportation. So the goal of the policy is to get people using transit to reduce VMT, but a side effect of the policy is it does place people's homes closer to these high volume roadways. Typically not the highest volume roadways or the freeways, but still the arterials and the principal highways. So wondering if you have any thoughts on that, perhaps based on your air quality modeling research and impact studies.
Yeah, so this is an issue that has entered this conversation around transit-oriented development. Is the proximity of homes, particularly to this. And coming from, since I lived in Oakland so much, it's interesting, and you see that there's push out, but the people kind of moving in right next to these transportation systems are higher income folks. So it's a very interesting kind of dynamic that we're seeing right now. And so what is the solution? Well, one, I think that we do need to have some kind of buffer because of the exposure to transportation emissions. However, at the same time, this will require densification of communities. And so if you're going to limit to make sure that we don't increase exposure, we're still going to have to increase the building of denser communities in order so that people can still live and be close to transportation.
Yeah, and I think in Los Angeles and the East Bay, perhaps Berkeley is the latest example. There is a move to densify single-family neighborhoods with duplexes and more multi-family units, and those tend to be further away from the high-volume roadways. So I have one additional question. So back to the Cypress Freeway in Oakland. You talked about Caltrans wanted to build something, and the neighborhood was opposed and had an opportunity in law. This is actually prior to environmental justice being included as a NEPA consideration. I believe that was 1995. That Clinton signed an executive order to formally include it. But the community was able to use the National Environmental Policy Act review process, which the freeway receiving federal funds was subject to. And could you talk a little bit more about that history and your understanding of what had happened there? Because it wasn't just you send a letter and the FHWA and Caltrans agree, yes, you're right.
Yes, and so I appreciate this question because again, it reinserts the people into these conversations. And so what was happening on the ground? And so a lot of organizing happened, and it was a lot of multi-stakeholder organizing where you had former politicians, like the former mayor was involved, you had a former transit director who was involved, as well as residents and community members. And so you had this coalition that formed to really push for this different route. And so it was a multi-year effort. Again, it took 2 years for this process, but it really speaks to the power that they had in having folks from economic sector, businesses, the community that was impacted, again, former politicians. And so you had really community power and organizing around. No, you're not going to rebuild this freeway here, but reroute it in an area that has less residential impact. And so it's a very powerful case study. Somebody who was involved, Ms. Margaret Gordon, who is the co-director of the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, which helped allowed me to do my study. And so it's like someone who has just this institutional knowledge of organizing in Oakland. And so she was involved in a lot of just that history around community organizing for change. And this was a successful case in terms of rerouting and moving that freeway.
Yeah, and we've been able to feature more contemporary equity-based work in Oakland in some of our other events. So we've had Oakland DOT Director Ryan Russo speak at one of our events a few years ago about the equity focus with the repaving program in Oakland. I don't know if that's something that you saw when you were living there. Well, yeah. One of the things, in many cities, services are driven by complaints and access to power, and that's the way the system works. And you have to take deliberate steps to address that system in order to dismantle the role of racism in those power structures. And so Oakland's repaving plan was based on need, so that not just the conditions of the roadways, but also who was living in the neighborhoods and the consequences of if they hit a pothole and their car broke. For a upper income Oakland Hills resident, that meant they called an Uber or rented a car. But for somebody with lower income and was in jeopardy of not keeping a job if they were late to work, it was the difference between having an income and not having an income. And so I guess the point, and perhaps you have thoughts on it, is that this organizing wasn't done in isolation. That Oakland has a history of organizing for equity, and that continues to this day. And I think some of what the city do continues to be example for what other places can't do. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that general about Oakland. That's a former resident.
The only thing I will say is that Oakland, that's what I loved about living in Oakland, is that rich organizing history. People are very familiar with Black Panther Party, and so Black Panther organizing, which is the legacy of which still continues to show in Oakland. And so yeah, that rich history, and thinking about it from a transportation, Oakland was able to develop in this rich community because of its really development as kind of that western stop of the railroad. And so you get the Pullman Porters, and then so that rich history, which ties back to transportation around the Pullman Porters, and you get the development of West Oakland. And that's really what kind of the foundations and the history even before the Black Panthers. And so yeah, it's a very rich history.
Okay. And I think Madeline has another question or two queued up for us.
Yeah, so we're just going to hop back around. And so going back to the question of fare free public transit, there's questions about how can this be done in a way that is just. So for context, here in Los Angeles, a lot has been spoken and written about how we're a self-help county, and the residents of the county have voted to tax themselves to actually raise money for transportation. And so we have a lot of sales tax that goes to transportation. However, this is a regressive tax. So the question asks, if we were going to think about going to a fare-free transit model, and this may be a little bit too specific to Los Angeles, but feel free to broaden, how can that where can the money come from to still support high quality transit service? Because doing this with a more sales tax is likely to, may create a more regressive financing approach.
Yes, and thank you for this question. And so to me, this really gets to taking money from another pot. And for me, as I discussed throughout my presentation, one of those pots is policing. My family is in San Diego, for instance, and there was organizing around the budget where the city budget was like 85% policing. And that's crazy. And so when we talk about these services that actually benefit community, public transit is a service that benefits community. And so the money exists. The money is there. It's about what are city budgets going to do to reflect that and reflect actually providing community services. And that really takes, as I said, divesting from things such as policing, and divesting from that police budget. And so for me, it's not a question about is there enough money? It's a question about where are we allocating money? And so for public transit, taking the money from policing and putting it into things such as public transit, as well as affordable housing, as well as into education, as well as into healthcare services. The money is there, but it's going to take some effort to really get city budgets to change and divest from policing.
Okay. Madeline, do you have another question queued up for us?
We have so many. I'm kind of scrolling back and forth, and I feel like this is probably going to be our last question. So I want to end on a really strong note. Well, one question is about, and I don't think you touched on it as we've covered so much ground, but one of the maybe new modes or new technologies to an existing mode is thinking about electric bicycles. And so I think I saw a little bit of kind of maybe federal action on this, but so the question is, have you thought about incentives to help, increase access to electric bikes, since they are a lot more expensive than the Huffy you drag out of the garage? And any thoughts about, the potential of this old mode with new technology to be part of this kind of converging route idea?
Yeah, so definitely this this kind of ties back into the previous question around the fact that, for instance, Black folks do bike, and people do bike. And so how can biking be integrated as a solution? And how can we support that financially? And so that's not something that I've actually really thought about. I thought about this in terms of like the improving infrastructure to help get people to be able to bike, but not in terms of the financing mechanisms to help people get onto electric bikes. So that is definitely something that raises a great point, and definitely something for me to do.
Okay, so we have indeed covered a lot of ground. We're approaching the end of our time. So I was wondering if you had any closing comments or final word that you wanted to impart on our audience gathered here today.
Yeah, I just again want to thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk today, and thank everyone who joined this talk. And if there's one message that I want to leave people with, it is that we really should be working towards a free, accessible, climate just, and safe public transit system, both through emerging mobility options as well as a reparative justice and dismantling of the systems that perpetuate inequities. And so making sure that these two are in conversation to again ensure public transit.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. I think the message and the evidence in support of that was quite clear. I really enjoyed your presentation today as part of our Perloff series on race and transportation. And we have 4 more talks coming up, 2 on human infrastructure and whether bike and ped infrastructure is safe and for whom. One, as Dr. Patterson mentioned, the role of police in transportation. We actually have a law professor, Sarah Seo from Columbia University, who will be talking about how the advent of the automobile and its perpetuation through city streets actually led to a substantial increasing in local police forces and the discretion that local police forces would wield in enforcing or not enforcing traffic laws, and the introduction of racial bias through that discretion and that substantial expansion of the police force. And then on March 11, we'll have Walter Thompson Hernandez, a journalist and multimedia artist who has a book on cowboys in Compton, as well as a podcast and his coming of age in Los Angeles in the 80s, 90s. And so please join us for the rest of this series. You can find out more at its.ucla.edu events. And again, thank you very much, Dr. Patterson, for joining us today as an excellent kickoff to this series. All right,
Thank you for
everyone.
having me.
Thank you.